Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. If you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about the lost treasure at Skeleton Canyon. And this was the very first story that I put up on my channel, and I feel like it was lacking a few things. So we're going to retell the story, and there's maybe a few details we didn't have in the first story, and we're probably missing some slides and pictures of some of the area. So I felt it would be good to redo this story because this is one of the probably top 5 buried treasures in Arizona. Along with the Lost Dutchman, it's one that a lot of people know about. And my channel, since it started, it's migrated a lot to Wild West and Lost Treasure, and anyhow. So I decided it's probably best to redo this one. So anyhow, Skeleton Canyon treasure story starts out in 1881 on the Mexican side of the Arizona-Mexico border, I believe in Sonora, or the state of Sonora, Mexico. And there was a little saloon and cantina in a little Mexican village down there, and an Arizona outlaw and bandit named Jim Hughes was sitting and having a few drinks and minding his own business, as the story goes. And as he sat there, nearby was sitting some members of some Mexican outlaws. They were members of the Estrada gang. And they were having a great old time. They were celebrating and drinking a bit excessively, and they were celebrating their big robbery in score in the town of Monterrey, Mexico. So either the gang didn't know that the gringo sitting near them also spoke and understood Spanish, or they just got a little bit loud and maybe lazy during their celebrating and didn't realize, as Jim started to listen into the general topic of their joy. And apparently their score was huge. It had netted them gold and silver coins, gold bars, and other gold and silver artifacts. So Jim overheard this, and he overheard them planning to head north with their loot and smuggle it into the U.S. through Skeleton Canyon. And Skeleton Canyon is very close to the Mexico border, and it's down in the southeast corner of Arizona, very close to the New Mexico border. So Jim decides that would be a lot of loot for him and his friends if they could get their hands on it. And they're pretty familiar with the canyons of southeast Arizona, including Skeleton Canyon, as he was an outlaw and hid out and used these canyons a fair amount himself. So these canyons were regularly used by the outlaws all the time to smuggle goods, and so outlaws tend to know them fairly well. And it's very remote, too. So Jim takes off as fast as he can for Arizona to alert his friends and come up with a plan to rob these Mexican banditos. So they hatched a plan to send a couple gang members down to the little Mexican village to watch the gang. So a couple members of Jim's gang are heading down to Mexico to kind of watch over the Mexican bandito gang, the Estrada gang, and watch things so they can determine when they might be going to smuggle these goods through Skeleton Canyon. So they're watching for them to, get supplies and, loading up mules and getting things ready for the trip. So it seemed that what Jim had overheard during the planning process while the banditos were partying before was that it was going to be a little while before they were going to head through the canyon. And the banditos, it ended up, were going to head through the canyon a little sooner rather than later. So this caused a little bit of a problem for Jim Hughes, whose friends were members of the Curly Bill Brocious gang and the Clanton gang. So some of the gang were in town, but some of them were away and would not be back in town in time to help with the planned attack of the banditos. So I believe Old Man Clanton, Billy Clanton, and Curly Bill Brocious were involved in the planning. I don't know if they were all involved in the actual ambush in Skeleton Canyon. I believe Old Man Clanton may have been out of town, and Curly Bill Brocious may have also been out of town. So Jim Hughes was worried that they didn't have enough manpower, and he brought in two more of his friends, Billy Grounds and Zwing Hunt. So the gang went into the canyon, and they found some high ground to perch on near an area called Devil's Kitchen. Here they felt they had a good vantage point to see the gang coming, but they could remain hidden on the high ground partway up the canyon wall. They felt that they would be more protected from gunfire in their positions too. To Jim Hughes and his friends' surprise, when the banditos got to the spot, they dismounted, and they cooked a meal, and they took a siesta. So I think the guys are surprised as they're watching. They're expecting them to come through and get within their gun sights, and they didn't do that. So they waited, and as they were taking a siesta, and as all the guys were taking a nap, the whole Estrada gang, then the Arizona gang started shooting the banditos, and there were 19 Mexican banditos that were all killed in the ambush. But disaster was about to strike next. The gang had made sure not to shoot any of the 26 mules that were heavily laden carrying all the gold and silver, and they wanted to make sure that they had these mules to smuggle the loot out. But what they didn't plan for was the excessive noise of the ambush that it had created, and with echoes ricocheting off the canyon walls, and it became really loud, and it scared the heck out of the mules. And the mules started running in all directions, and it forced the gang to have to shoot the mules to keep the loot from getting away. So there wasn't any mention of any of the mules getting away, but with 26 of them all scattering in different directions, I think there was a case later on where there definitely was probably at least one of them that did get away. And so at this point, it's a situation where they're there with all the Mexican banditos that have passed on, and the mules are dead, and they have all this treasure now in these mules that are loaded down in the saddlebags, and they need to figure out what to do. So they rounded up all the treasure that had been scattered everywhere by the fleeing mules, and then they decided that they were going to need to bury a lot of this treasure. So first they lined their pockets and their saddlebags with gold coins and silver coins, and then they decided they needed to pick a spot, and they went ahead and buried the treasure and figured as long as they were loaded down with plenty of gold, that they could go have a good time for, quite a while, a month or two or longer or whatever. And they figured they could come back for the treasure later, or the remainder of the treasure. So with their own horses, I'm sure they loaded them down, but they didn't have anywhere near the ability to carry everything. So the treasure was buried. They headed off to their towns and saloons in Tombstone and Charleston and Galeyville and Shakespeare, and they started to celebrate and have a grand old time, and they had plenty of money on them to last them for a good chunk of time. And later on, I'm sure they planned to come back for more treasure as they ran out of money. Well, it just so happened that Jim Hughes had second thoughts about sharing this treasure, and he may have felt that he had acquired this treasure, or they had acquired this treasure due to him specifically, and he decided to grab his buddies Billy Grounds and Zwing Hunt and double-cross the gang. So while the rest of the gang are out partying it up and drinking beer and whiskey in the local saloons, Jim has Billy and Zwing sneak back into the canyon and move the treasure. Jim figured he needed to stay in town as to not arouse any suspicion. So Billy and Zwing, they were to report back to Jim once the treasure was moved, so only 3 of them would now know where the treasure was. So Billy and Zwing, they found a Mexican gentleman with a wagon and a team of horses or mules and offered him a handsome payment to go into the canyon with them and go in and dig up this treasure. So I'm sure this Mexican teamster didn't know what was going on until it was probably too late. But once in the canyon, they waited for dusk and then they dug up the treasure and they loaded it into the wagon, and it was said they continued all night before stopping in the morning as the sun came up, and they reburied the treasure. So we don't know which direction they went in Skeleton Canyon, if they stayed in Skeleton Canyon or if they went off into a side chute canyon, which is a heavy possibility too. So after the treasure was buried again, of course, they killed the Mexican teamster and they burned the wagon over the mound where they buried the treasure. So they now felt that they needed to keep watch on the area, and they found a large cave high up on the canyon wall where they could see the spot that they buried the treasure. It seemed that the gang had no idea that the treasure was moved for some time, and some of the gang would die in a shootout at the OK Corral a couple of months later and probably never had any idea that the treasure was ever moved. So Billy and Zwing were said to hang out in the cave for a couple of months, maybe up to 4 months, depending on the account that you go by. So we know some details here because Billy wrote some letters to his sister Maggie in San Antonio. He would ride out of the canyon and catch a nearby mail stagecoach and give them letters to mail off to his sister, and I'm sure he had some coins to pay them for postage. So Billy mentioned in his letters that him and Zwing were staying in a very deep cave, maybe 80 feet deep at the mouth of the canyon, where they could have a fire and they could watch the turf grow back over the spot that they buried the treasure. Billy also said that near the treasure was a 10-foot tall cascade of water and 2 more small springs, and the treasure was supposed to be buried just beyond that near a 3-foot tall square-shaped rock. Eventually, Zwing and Billy came out of the canyon and they got involved in a robbery at the Tombstone Milling Company, I believe. And they were trailed back to a friend Jack Chandler's ranch by the law, or at least found there, I believe, the next day. So this part troubles me a little bit. If, maybe they just couldn't keep their nose out of trouble, but why would they get involved in a robbery? They should have had all the money that they could need at that point. So not sure what that situation was, or if they didn't want to go back into the canyon to grab some more money. So anyhow, what had happened was when the law caught up to them at their friend Jack Chandler's ranch, a shootout ensued and Billy was killed. And Zwing was also injured and he was taken to a Tombstone hospital. I guess they just couldn't stay out of trouble. But when Jim Hughes heard about this, what happened was he was probably concerned that if Zwing died, then no one's going to know where the treasure was reburied at. But when Jim got to the hospital, Zwing had escaped from custody already, and there were 2 stories of what happened to Zwing. One story was told by his brother that he was killed by Indians after his escape, and I believe his brother helped him escape, but then he was supposedly killed by Indians. The other story said that he made it back to Texas where he was from, and he succumbed to his injuries, but not before he helped his uncle draw a map of the treasure location and gave some other important location details. So at this point, the Zwing Hunt family came to look for the treasure. So did Billy's sister Maggie. Neither side found the treasure. In 1891, though, a saddlebag of Mexican gold and silver was found in a side canyon. Probably one of the scared mules dropped its load, and it was found later in 1891. So Maggie and another man, Maggie is Billy's sister, so Maggie and another man came out to the area, and they lived in a cave in the area for 2 years looking for the treasure. So We don't believe she would have done this if she didn't think there really was a big treasure to find. And in a cave in the canyon, treasure hunter Fern Hamill said he found a little vase with the inscription on it that said Maggie 1885 World's Fair. So Fern Hamill believed that he knew where the treasure was buried and he put all the clues together, but he said that he believed the 1886 earthquake buried it under maybe 20 feet of rubble when the mountain caved off on it. And I believe Fern is no longer with us, but he was a really good treasure hunter. So there's a few important details that came from Zwing's account and the map. He said that they buried the treasure near the base of Davis Mountain. So this has caused confusion because Billy and Zwing named Davis Mountain for their friend Jim Davis that they buried there. Many people take this mountain, the name literally, as there is a Davis Mountain further north quite a ways, I believe near Morenci, Arizona. So some people think that's the area where the buried treasure is, but they wouldn't have been able to make it that far in one night with the Mexican teamster. So people that know a bit about the legend believe that Davis Mountain is one of the peaks in the Piloncillo Mountains near the New Mexico-Arizona border, close to Skeleton Canyon. And Zwing had said that very close to the mountain is a curving canyon whose east wall was completely rocky and the west wall was covered in trees. Through the canyon was a small stream that had a 10-foot drop where water cascaded down near two springs. 20 steps east of the treasure site was a square-shaped rock about 3 feet high. Over the burial site would be remnants of a burnt wagon. And from Billy's account came these details. The cave, meaning the one that they stayed in when they watched over the treasure site, is at the mouth of the canyon. From our lookout, you can see the turf growing back over the treasure site. So experts believe this is a real treasure, as every time it rained for many years, people would find human skulls and bones and mule bones and Mexican gold and silver coins scattered throughout the canyon. So that is the story of the treasure in Skeleton Canyon, and it is one experts believe really is there, but it's possible that it could be buried in deeper after that earthquake. That earthquake had an epicenter not too far south of Skeleton Canyon, and it did cause a lot of cave-offs and caused a lot of damage, but those areas weren't very populated, so it didn't make the news a whole lot. So that is the story of the treasure in Skeleton Canyon.